Good afternoon, seventh period. So yesterday we did the urbanization simulation, and we talked that out a little bit afterwards about why your city got to be the way it was and some of the problems that resulted from that. And today we're going to be looking at the notes for that information. So hopefully you already have a pretty good idea of some of what we're going to be talking about because of that activity yesterday. But today we're going to be looking at some of the specifics. So let's go ahead and get started. So today we're looking at immigration and urbanization. We're going to describe the journey that immigrants endured and their experiences at U.S. immigration stations, examine the causes and effects of the nativists' anti-immigration sentiments, explain how cities dealt with housing, transportation, sanitation, and safety issues, and then describe some of the organizations and people who offered help to urban immigrants. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that we need to talk about is the wave of immigration that comes to the United States here at the turn of the century. And when we talk about the turn of the century, this Gilded Age, we're talking about this period of 1870 to about 1920. So there's three big waves of immigration in U.S. history. The first is the original wave, so the colonists, the people who came here before we were even the United States. The second is before the Civil War, so in about the 1840s, and that wave of immigration is going to be mostly from Northern and Western Europe, from Germany, from England. But this is the third wave of immigration. And we're going to see more immigrants at this point in time from Europe, from Asia, and from the Caribbean than we typically have. So let's go ahead and look at where these immigrants were coming from and why they were coming to the United States in this big third wave of immigration that you see demonstrated here on our graph. So the first place that many immigrants were coming from was Europe. And like I said, that was nothing new, but what was different about this particular wave of immigration was that most of the immigrants coming at this point were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Places like Italy, Austria, Poland, Russia, Greece. Many of them were fleeing religious persecution, particularly Jews. There was a lot of violence against Europe's Jewish population at this point. Sometimes it was even encouraged by the countries. And so people were fleeing, looking for a place that they could be safe to practice their faith. You also had a lot of overpopulation in Europe. So Europe was experiencing the same thing as the U.S., where you had people that were leaving farms and moving to cities, except that Europe has a lot less space than the U.S. to put all of those people. And so there was a lot of overcrowding and overpopulation, especially in places like Rome, especially in Russia and Poland. You have these really overcrowded cities. So you also have a lot of people that are coming from Asia, particularly China and Japan. At first, people are going to come from China and Japan to participate in the gold rush of 1848, when gold is discovered in California. And then later, this is going to be a large population of people that work on the railroad during the railroad boom. We talked about before that the Transcontinental Railroad was built primarily on the backs of Chinese immigrants. You also have a lot of people that are coming from the Caribbean and from Latin America. These are people coming from Jamaica, Cuba, Mexico, the Bahamas, and most of these people are coming primarily for jobs. As the U.S. industrialized, every time you build a factory, well, now you need people to work in those factories. And the jobs in the U.S. were supposedly plentiful, and you didn't have to have a lot of skills in order to work in these factory jobs. And so people were coming to get these jobs. And then also political upheaval, revolutions, turmoil, violence. People are fleeing to the U.S. where they believe that they will be safe. So for all of this immigration and all of these high hopes that people had, there actually were a lot of difficulties on the journey from their home country to the U.S. and once they arrived in the U.S. So the first thing was the very uncomfortable journey by steamship. It took about a week to get on a steamship from Europe to the United States. Took about 3 weeks to get from China to the United States by a steamship. And as bad as that sounds, to be on an old rickety ship for that long, most immigrants were traveling in steerage, which was basically the cargo hold of the boat, where people weren't even really supposed to be. Like, that's just where all the stuff was, like people's luggage. You would have to sleep on a bunk that might be infested by lice. You wouldn't have a room. You'd just be in like a big open space with lots of other people. You're sharing one bathroom with probably hundreds of people. There's just no privacy, no fresh air, no way to get exercise. It just was a pretty bad way to be for a week or more at a time. If you've ever seen the movie Titanic, this is where Jack is riding, is down in steerage. So you had the uncomfortable journey, and then people finally arrived in the U.S., and then they had to be processed. So the processing station for immigrants on the East Coast was Ellis Island, as you hopefully are already familiar with. And Ellis Island wasn't necessarily an easy place to navigate. There were thousands of people coming in every day. There was a multi-step process that you had to go through in order to enter the country. First, people got a medical exam to make sure that you didn't have any contagious diseases or that you weren't having any serious health problems like tuberculosis. And if you did, you would get sent home after your journey. People who passed the medical exam then reported to a government inspector, and the government inspector looked at your documents and then questioned immigrants about whether or not they met the legal requirements for entering the United States. These were requirements like being able to prove that you had never been convicted of a felony, demonstrating that you were able to work, and showing that you had at least some money. So Ellis Island was the chief immigration station in the United States from 1892 to 1924. An estimated 17 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island on their way to the U.S. So European immigrants arrived primarily on the East Coast and passed through Ellis Island, but Asians, primarily Chinese immigrants, arrived on the West Coast, and they passed through Angel Island in San Francisco Bay. Between 1910 and 1940, about 50,000 Chinese immigrants entered the U.S. through Angel Island. Processing at Angel Island was really different than processing at Ellis Island. Processing at Angel Island, you had like really harsh questioning. It was more of an interrogation than just a going through customs, show your documents kind of thing. The people that were held there were held in filthy, ramshackle buildings that didn't have any heat or air, basically just shacks until they were let in. And people would wait weeks before they found out if they had been admitted or rejected. So Angel Island is going to be really different than Ellis Island. So once immigrants got to the United States, they faced a lot of problems. Things like finding a place to live, getting a job, just getting along in a culture and in a country where you might not speak the language, you might not eat the same type of foods as the people around you, you might not worship like the people around you, your family structure might be really different. And so what we see is immigrants seeking out people who shared their culture, their religion, their language, and spoke the same language as them. And so these ethnic communities are going to spring up all over the U.S.'s big cities where immigrants are coming in. And this is where you get your Chinatown. This is where you get your Little Italy. Places like that where immigrants are going to work together to build a community where they feel comfortable in a brand new country where they might not feel so comfortable. So we're going to see a lot of cooperation within ethnic groups just to get by and to get acclimated to the U.S. while also surrounded by some friendly faces. So this is a silly little video, but this is from the movie Fievel, An American Tale, which is about like a little mouse that leaves Russia and comes to the U.S. I mean, it's obviously very silly, but I think it does a really good job of helping you visualize why people were coming to the U.S. and help you understand the hopes that immigrants had for coming to the U.S. So anyways, I hope that you understand or that you enjoy this.
I didn't see any cats. Oh. Won't it be nice to get to America where we don't have to worry about cats anymore? There are no cats in America.
But back home in Mother Russia, our family was traveling through the snow to Minsk. Suddenly Papa saw those huge paw prints. When I heard him screaming, I fainted dead away, and I woke up an orphan.
But
There are no cats in America, and the streets are paved with cheese. Oh, there are no cats in America, so set your mind at ease.
Non sa la cosa terribile che esiste nella patria mia. Do you think that things were bad in Russia? You should see things in my country. The times were hard in Sicily. We had no provolone. The Don, he was a tabby with a taste for my brother Tony. When Mama went to plead for him, the Don said he would see her. We found her rosary on the ground. Poor Mamma Mia. But
There are no cats in America, and the streets are paved with cheese. Oh, there are no cats in America, so set your mind at ease.
That's sad, but sadder still. When I was but a lad, I lost my true love fair. A calico, he caught us by surprise. In a flash of teeth and fur, her tail was all he left of her. 'Neath the heather is where it Turalura lies.
But there are no cats in America, and the streets are paved with cheese. Oh, there are no cats in America, so set your minds in America. There are no cats in America, there are no cats in
Okay, so like I said, pretty silly, but we saw a Russian mouse immigrant and an Italian mouse immigrant and an Irish mouse immigrant, and they had each faced some sort of violence or persecution in their life, and they were all hoping to come to the U.S. where they wouldn't face that sort of violence and persecution and upheaval. And they expressed this hope by saying that there are no cats in America. But of course we know there are cats in America. So looking now, some of the problems that we see with this rise in immigration. So there's sort of this idea that the United States is a melting pot, and that actually comes from this time period. There was a play called The Melting Pot that talked about some immigrants that had come to America and were learning to live in America with lots of other immigrant groups. But this idea of the melting pot didn't really sit very well with a lot of people. And one of those groups that were not down for the country to be a melting pot were the nativists. So one response to the growth in immigration was nativism, which was overt or very obvious favoritism toward native-born Americans. Nativism gave rise to anti-immigrant groups and led to a demand for immigration restrictions. So many nativists believed that Anglo-Saxons, who are like German and British, Northern French, basically the Germanic ancestors of the English, were superior to other ethnic groups. They did not object to immigrants from what they considered to be the right countries like Britain and Germany and Scandinavian. But they did object to immigration from countries that they thought of as the wrong countries. So Spain, Italy, Poland, Asian countries, basically anything that wasn't like Northwest European. They sometimes objected more to immigrants' religious beliefs than to their ethnic backgrounds. Many native-born Americans were Protestant and thought that Roman Catholic and Jewish immigrants would undermine the democratic institutions established by the country's Protestant founders. The American Protective Association was a nativist group founded in 1887, and they launched vicious anti-Catholic attacks, and many colleges, business, and social clubs refused to admit Jews. In 1897, Congress, influenced by the Immigration Restriction League, passed a bill requiring a literacy test for immigrants. If you couldn't read 40 words in English or in your native language, you would be refused entry. President Cleveland vetoed the bill, but it was a powerful statement of the public sentiment against immigrants. And in 1917, there would be a similar bill passed into law despite President Woodrow Wilson's veto. So there's also a lot of anti-Asian sentiment. This is going to find a foothold in the West, where native-born workers feared that their jobs would go to Chinese immigrants instead of them because the Chinese immigrants would accept lower wages. So the Depression of 1873 just made all of this worse. Work was scarce. Labor groups put political pressure on the government to restrict Asian immigration. So you have an anti-Chinese movement in California where you have people going all over the state and all over the country pretty much just bad-mouthing the Chinese and encouraging the government to restrict immigration. In 1882, Congress did restrict Chinese immigration for 10 years by passing the Chinese Exclusion Act. It banned entry to all Chinese except students, teachers, merchants, tourists, and government officials. And in 1892, Congress extended the law for another 10 years. In 1902, Chinese immigration was restricted indefinitely, and this law was not repealed until 1943. So the fears that had led to anti-Chinese agitation were also extended to Japanese and other Asian people in the early 1900s. In 1906, the local Board of Education in San Francisco segregated Japanese children by putting them in separate schools. When Japan raised an angry protest at this treatment of its immigrants, President Teddy Roosevelt worked out a deal. This deal is called the Gentleman's Agreement, and under this deal, Japan's government agreed to limit immigration of unskilled workers to the U.S. in exchange for the integration of schools in the West Coast between Japanese and white children. So although the doorways for immigrants had been all but closed to Asians on the West Coast, cities in the East and the Midwest were teeming with European immigrants, and this brought lots of urban opportunities and urban challenges, which we will look at now. So like we said, many immigrants are going to settle in cities. Cities are cheap. Cities are convenient. There's plenty of jobs in cities. And this is going to lead to the Americanization movement. So the Americanization movement was designed to assimilate people of lots of different cultures into the dominant white Protestant American culture. It was a social campaign that was sponsored by the government and by concerned citizens. Schools and voluntary associations provided programs to teach immigrants skills that were needed for citizenship, like English literacy, American history and government, cooking, social etiquette, all of those sorts of things that basically would help you be a member of American society as well as become a citizen. So despite these efforts, a lot of immigrants didn't want to abandon their tradition. Ethnic communities provided social support of other immigrants from the same country, which enabled them to speak their own language and practice their customs and religions. So a lot of immigrants didn't really buy into this Americanization movement. So another reason for urbanization, which is just the growth of cities, was migration from country to city. So we talked a little bit about a lot of the new farm machines that were making it easier to farm. So, if it used to take 10 people to harvest a field, but now it only takes 2 because you have machines that can help you do it, well, what happens to those other 8 people? Okay, they don't have a job on the farm anymore, and if they want to feed their children, they're going to have to go somewhere else to find a job. And jobs in cities are plentiful. Every time you build a new factory to make more products, well, you need people to work in those factories. And so you have this mass migration of farmers that are pushed off their land that go to cities for jobs. You also have a lot of African Americans that move north and west from the South to escape the persecution that rises in this post-Reconstruction era. So they're hoping that they will find a better job with less racism and basically just a better life in a northern or western city. Unfortunately, it is not much better there. So the last thing that we need to talk about are some urban problems. And this is kind of what we were looking at yesterday with our activity. That fifth reflection question had asked you to think about, what are some of the problems that are going to arise when you have this many people in such a small area? One big problem is housing. So when the industrial age began, working class families in cities had two housing options. They could either buy a house on the outskirts of town where it would be really hard to get into the city for work every day, or you could rent a really cramped room in a boarding house within the city. But as the urban population increased, there were new types of housing designed. One is the row house, which today we would call like a townhome or a garden home. Basically, it's a single family house, but you share walls with another person's single family house. This packed a lot of families onto a single block, but after working class families left the central city, immigrants often took over their old housing, and sometimes 2 or 3 families would occupy a one-family residence. So you have what was designed to just be an apartment for one family that maybe has 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different families living in it. And these multifamily urban dwellings came to be called tenements, and they were overcrowded and unsanitary. So to try to improve the slum conditions, New York passed a law that set minimum standards for plumbing and ventilation in apartments. Landlords began building tenements with air shafts that provided an outside window for each room. Because garbage wasn't picked up very frequently, people would sometimes dump it into the air shafts that they just built, and that would attract a lot of bugs and mice. So to keep out the smell, residents started nailing their windows shut. So even though they were established with good intent, these new tenements became really bad places to live and were much worse to live in than the single-family residences. Another big problem in the cities was transportation, but this was solved by innovations in mass transit. So mass transit are transportation systems designed to move large numbers of people along fixed routes, and these enabled workers to go to and from their jobs more easily. Streetcars were introduced in San Francisco in 1873, and electric subways were introduced in Boston in 1897. By the early 20th century, mass transit networks in many urban areas linked city neighborhoods to one another and to the outlying communities. And so that was a help with those transportation issues. Some other issues that cities faced were water and sanitation and crime and fire. So cities did not have safe drinking water. As the urban population grew, cities like New York and Cleveland built public waterworks to try to handle the increasing demand. Many residents of cities had really inadequate piped water or none at all. Even in large cities like New York, houses seldom had indoor plumbing, meaning bathrooms, and residents had to collect water in pails from faucets on the street and then heat it up if they wanted to take a bath. The necessity of improving water quality to control diseases like cholera and typhoid fever was obvious, and to make city water safer, filtration was introduced in the 1870s and then chlorination in the early 1900s. But even so, in the early 20th century, many city dwellers did not have access to safe water. As the cities grew, so did the challenge of keeping them clean. Horse manure piled up on the streets, sewage, meaning like bathroom waste, flowed through open gutters, and factories spewed gross smoke up into the air. There was no dependable trash collection, so people just dumped their garbage on the streets. There were private contractors called scavengers that were hired to sweep the streets and collect garbage and clean outhouses, but they often didn't do their jobs very well. By 1900, many cities had developed sewer lines and created sanitation departments, but the task of providing hygienic living conditions was an ongoing challenge. Finally, the problems of crime and fire. So as the populations of cities increased, pickpockets and thieves flourished. New York City organized the first full-time salaried police force in 1844, and most other city law enforcement units were too small to have an impact on crime, but they were at least trying. So fire, the limited water supply in many cities contributed to the spread of fires. Major fires occurred in almost every large American city during the 1870s and the 1880s. In addition to lacking water with which to combat the fires, most cities were packed with wooden dwellings, which were like kindling just waiting to be ignited. You also had people using candles and kerosene heaters, and that posed a fire hazard. So San Francisco had a lot of fires after earthquakes. At first, most city firefighters were volunteers and weren't always available when they were needed, but Cincinnati tackled this problem when it established the nation's first paid fire department in 1853. By the 1900s, most cities had full-time professional fire departments, and then the introduction of the automatic fire sprinkler in 1874 and the replacement of wood with brick, stone, or concrete as a building material also made cities safer. So the last thing that we need to talk about are social welfare reformers. So as problems in cities mounted, concerned Americans worked to find solutions, and social welfare reformers targeted their efforts at relieving urban poverty. An early reform program called the Social Gospel Movement preached salvation through service to the poor. They were inspired by the message of the social gospel movement, and many 19th century reformers responded to the call to help the urban poor. One way that they helped in the late 1800s was to establish settlement houses, which were community centers in slum neighborhoods that provided assistance to people in the area, especially to immigrants. Many settlement workers lived at the houses so that they could learn firsthand about the problems caused by urbanization and then help to create solutions. They were run largely by middle-class, college-educated women, and settlement houses provided educational, cultural, and social services. They provided classes in English, health, painting, offered college extension courses. Some sent visiting nurses into the homes of the sick and provided whatever aid was needed to help the people. Settlement houses in the U.S. were founded by Charles Stover and Stanton Coit in New York City in 1886. Jane Addams was one of the most influential members of the settlement house movement. She and another lady founded Chicago's Hull House in 1889. And then you also had settlement houses founded in Hampton, Virginia, and that was the first settlement house for African Americans. By 1910, about 400 settlement houses were operating in cities across the country, and they helped cultivate social responsibility toward the urban poor. So what you're going to do now is get a little slip of paper from the sub, and that is going to tell you about what type of immigrant you are going to be in order to write an entry in an immigration diary. So you're writing a journal entry from the perspective of the person whose biography you choose from the bucket or that the sub hands you, and you're going to use this to explore some of the reasons that people immigrated and then some of the problems and solutions that they faced once they entered the country. So be sure to include in your diary entry why and how you journeyed from your native country, what it was like to arrive at Ellis Island or Angel Island and be processed, details about your new life in America, and then information about any other details included in your biography. So that is going to be what you're going to do for the rest of class. You need to turn it in when you're done and then do your comp check. All right, thanks guys.